is joining us. And can folks mute? Make sure they're muted. We're in meeting format, not webinar format, so it's really important for you to stay muted.
Catherine, you appear to be muted as
Oh,
well.
sorry. Was I muted the whole time? Okay, thanks for telling me. Okay, great. So thank you for joining us for the webinar, Guatemala Hope for the Future, co-sponsored by the Office of Public Witness of the Presbyterian Church USA and the Guatemala Human Rights Commission USA. I'm Catherine Gordon. I'm the representative for international issues with the PCUSA Office of Public Witness. And I will turn it over to Veronica to introduce herself and say a little bit about the Guatemala Human Rights Commission.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Veronica Serrano. I'm the Director of Outreach and Development here at the Guatemala Human Rights Commission in the Washington, D.C. office. And GHRC has been working, was founded in 1982 by Sister Alice Sackman, and we have an office here in Washington, D.C. and an office in Guatemala City. We provide support to defenders who face threats of violence and support for human rights defenders. And here in the Washington, D.C. office, we do advocacy. So thank you all for being here, and I will turn it over to Catherine.
Great. So Guatemala has suffered through many years of military rule, a 1954 coup orchestrated by the CIA, decades of internal armed conflict, the frustrated hopes of the 1996 peace accords, and a series of corrupt governments. In August 2023, Bernardo Arevalo was elected president after voters, frustrated by rampant corruption and the failure of past leaders to address it, chose him as a candidate for change. President Arevalo has vowed to fight corruption, stating, "We will build a democratic and healthy unity on the rubble of the wall of corruption, brick by brick." But the president and his administration face strong opposition from corrupt officials and their allies in the private sector who continue to undermine anti-corruption efforts. And Guatemala also grapples with other serious challenges, including poverty, food insecurity, and violence that are driving irregular migration and displacement. So today we're going to hear from experts who will address the root causes of the issues facing Guatemala, as well as strategies to move forward towards a more hopeful future. And before we turn to our panelists, I'd like to introduce Doug Michael from the Presbyterian Church USA Guatemala Mission Network. And he worked with our mission co-worker on the ground, Leslie Vogel, who's serving as one of our interpreters today, just to put together a little message about the Presbyterian Church and Guatemala. Doug?
Thank you, Catherine. My name is Doug Michael, and I'm the co-chair of the Guatemala Partnership Committee of the Presbytery of Western North Carolina. It's really a pleasure to be here today with Catherine and the Presbyterian Church USA's Office of Public Witness, and in partnership here also with Veronica and the Guatemala Human Rights Commission. I'd like to speak briefly about the past and the present work of Presbyterians in Guatemala and our hopes for our future ministry together. Presbyterians have been serving in Guatemala since 1882, when missionaries were personally invited by President Justo Rufino Barrios to the country in an effort to encourage Protestant growth as a means of counteracting the immense economic and political power wielded by the Roman Catholic Church. By 1950, 5 presbyteries had been established across the country, and in 1962, the National Evangelical Presbyterian Church of Guatemala was formed. The manner in which we do mission as Presbyterians across the globe has evolved greatly over the last century. Presently, 13 presbyteries and many individual churches throughout the United States have formed partnerships with presbyteries, churches, and other bodies in Guatemala. 2 mission co-workers from the PCUSA collaborate with their Presbyterian counterparts, with ecumenical organizations, and with NGOs in Guatemala. This model of partnership, as opposed to the more hierarchical and paternalistic relationships of the past, allows for deeper relationships and for transformative work. Our ministries exist in the fields of education, health, economic justice, and violence prevention. We worship, break bread, and enjoy being together. And along the way, we have come to understand much of the deep injustice and inequity that exists in Guatemala, witnessing how it extends to every aspect of daily life for our partners. And so in late 2023, following President Arevalo's election, and in the midst of a flurry of anti-democratic activity on behalf of the entrenched Guatemalan elites, members of our presbytery were asked by our Guatemalan siblings to convey to our national church the nature of the plight of the people of Guatemala. A resolution was drafted and approved unanimously by the General Assembly of the PCUSA in July of this past year. Such resolutions become official policy of our denomination, and so, as individuals and through our churches, agencies, and our institutions, and in collaboration with our partners, we are determined to do the following. We will pray for the people of Guatemala, work to become better informed of the country's history and the ongoing situation there, support those who are working for democracy and their efforts to eliminate corruption, and advocate to the U.S. government and to international bodies on behalf of peace and justice in Guatemala. That is why we're here today with the Office of Public Witness of the Presbyterian Church USA and with the Guatemala Human Rights Commission. We hope that as a result of our time together, you'll find yourselves better informed and that you'll be inspired and empowered to engage more deeply and effectively in the work of peace and justice in Guatemala. So Catherine, at this point, will go ahead and introduce our other speakers. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Doug. So now we're going to move into our panelists. Our first speaker will be Judge Miguel Ángel Galvez Aguilar. Judge Galvez is a renowned Guatemalan scholar and judge with over 25 years of judicial experience, specializing in human rights, the rule of law, and combating impunity. He was named Global Jurist of the Year by Northwestern University for his human rights and anti-corruption work. Professor Luis Fernando Mack Dr. Mack is a Guatemalan sociologist, independent political analyst, and political science professor at Universidad de San Carlos de Guatemala. Pat Davis is president of the board of the Guatemala Human Rights Commission. She is a writer and longtime human rights activist and has written on Guatemala for The Nation, Counterpunch, Common Dreams, and Foreign Policy in Focus. And longer bios are available in the chat. So, Judge Galvez.
Perdón, juez, está en mute.
Okay.
Ahorita sí. Muchas gracias. Agradezco especialmente a los miembros de la Iglesia Presbiteriana, a la Comisión de Derechos Humanos, especialmente a Pat y a Verónica, por sus esfuerzos para este evento. Indudablemente que el esquema mundial de la democracia está bastante sensible. Nuestros países están sufriendo indudablemente que un desgaste de lo que es la política. Es interesante este tipo de análisis porque nos permite no solo comprender, sino quedarnos con esa cuestión de qué es lo que podemos hacer. Específicamente en el tema de Guatemala, quisiera hacerle referencia a que el 2023 entramos a un proceso de elecciones y en ese proceso de elecciones el movimiento Semilla era una de las últimas personas que estaban en las encuestas nacionales. ¿Y cuál fue la sorpresa? Que en junio del 2023 quedó en el segundo lugar y en la segunda vuelta, que fue en agosto del 2023, quedó en el primer lugar. El tema de la toma de posesión de Bernardo Arevalo, que era el presidente elegido democráticamente del movimiento Semilla, sufrió muchos problemas para llegar al 23 de enero del 2024, que era cuando tenía que tomar posesión. Así es como se da una campaña sistemática de criminalización en contra del movimiento civil. Prácticamente se hicieron allanamientos en el Tribunal Supremo Electoral, se hicieron diligencias de allanamiento en el Partido Civil y se dictaron varias órdenes de aprehensión. El propósito fundamental era buscar la forma no solo de anular las elecciones, sino que cancelar al movimiento Semilla. En Guatemala se da un despertar a principios de octubre, cuando los 48 cantones, cuando hablo de 48 cantones, es un movimiento indígena de Totonicapán, especialmente del sector que se le denomina el Triángulo Ishil, y en ese sector que se denomina Triángulo Ishil aparece lo que es Nevaj también. Entonces agarran el liderazgo los 48 cantones que son movimiento indígena y la alcaldía especialmente de Nevaj, y así es como se genera una movilización a nivel nacional. Inicia con la caminata de esos sectores para la ciudad capital, y ahí es como se va extendiendo el movimiento hasta llegar al extremo de paralizar completamente Guatemala. El sentido, como se dijo en su momento, que los pueblos originarios, o sea, los pueblos indígenas, no estaban defendiendo el movimiento semilla, sino que lo que estaban protegiendo es la democracia de Guatemala. Y es así como permanecieron prácticamente hasta enero del 2024, permanecieron más o menos 107, 106, 107 días en huelga. Por el tema de la fiscal general estuvieron mucho tiempo en el Ministerio Público, y así es. Aparte de ese esquema que le estoy haciendo referencia, la comunidad internacional presionó muy fuerte para el tema de la elección de la juramentación de Bernardo Arevalo, con aproximadamente con 8 o 10 horas de atraso, y tomó posesión el día 24 de enero. Entonces, uno de los problemas, y ya para ir sintetizando, uno de los problemas fundamentales que desde mi punto de vista se dan es que lamentablemente a un año de la presidencia de Bernardo Arevalo del movimiento Semilla se han visto muy pocos resultados, y me da la impresión que no es porque no haya voluntad política. El problema es que lamentablemente se da uno de los temas fundamentales que hay que analizar: la reconfiguración de todos los controles en una democracia. En Guatemala lo que pasó es que prácticamente eligen una Corte Suprema de Justicia ad hoc a los intereses de ciertos grupos, la Corte de Constitucionalidad, el Ministerio Público, y lamentablemente no se ha podido hacer absolutamente nada en el tema de Guatemala. Es increíble, a los 8 meses de ser presidente de la República, Bernardo Arevalo tenía aproximadamente 11 denuncias en su contra. Actualmente en la Corte Suprema de Justicia hay 4 antejuicios. Y uno de los problemas fundamentales que en este momento se puede analizar es que el próximo año viene la elección de la Corte de Constitucionalidad, viene la elección de fiscal general del Ministerio Público. Entonces, prácticamente estos momentos considero que van a ser más sensibles porque lo que se buscaría es evitar que Bernardo Arevalo elija especialmente la fiscal general. Yo considero que el tema de la fiscal general prácticamente como que desata ese nudo del lado oscuro de Guatemala y entraríamos a una fase de no solo de consolidar un Estado de Derecho para que el derecho como institución y herramienta para consolidar una democracia es fundamental en estos momentos. Entonces, este es uno de los panoramas que se puede analizar en el tema de Guatemala. Y aparte de este contexto, que estamos hablando muy nacional de Guatemala, tendríamos que tratar de entender ahora el contexto a nivel mundial. Es increíble cómo se está extendiendo la ultraderecha. Hemos estado viendo, hay algunos escritores muy modernos que hablan, que hacen referencia a uno de los temas fundamentales. De este solo voy a hacer mención porque no es el tema, en lo que es el populismo, lo que es la polarización y lo que es la posverdad. Se le denominan las 3P. Y en estas 3P únicamente solo voy a hacer referencia a lo que es la polarización, que es una de las 3P de estos instrumentos que se están utilizando. Y para mí la polarización significa demonizar sin descanso a los adversarios y resaltar asuntos, tanto viejos como nuevos, que dividen a la nación en una estrategia polarizada que por desgracia suele ser da muy buenos resultados. Y aquí lo que se busca es un enemigo, una ideología, una raza, una religión, rivalidades territoriales. Entonces, es prudente que en estos momentos, como lo indiqué al principio, que está muy sensible la situación, que analizáramos y que tratáramos de entender un poco más lo que puede ser el populismo, la polarización y la posverdad. Eh, y la polarización para mí significaría buscar un enemigo y distraer todo lo que se está haciendo por otro lado y enfocarse para que todos miren en ese punto sin saber todo lo que está pasando. Y ahí es donde entra, resalto lo que es el tema de ideología, lo que es raza, lo que es religión, lo que son problemas territoriales, pero eso es lo que se resalta. Entonces, lamentablemente, estos temas pues, se tendrían que analizar un poco más profundo, pero se deja una cuota en la cabecita de cada uno para que analicemos en dónde estamos y qué es lo que queremos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Thank you, Judge Galvez. That was very, very much food for thought as we are facing some similar issues in the United States. I think it's wonderful for us to have solidarity with the folks in Guatemala who are in this struggle as well. So thank you for that message. Now we're going to turn to Luis Mack.
Muchísimas gracias. Es un honor para mí estar en esta reunión. Un agradecimiento a los organizadores, al juez Galvez por su lucha y a todos los que nos oyen, justamente porque para nosotros es una gran esperanza realmente que nos esté. Como el del juez Galvez ya empezó platicando, pues estamos viviendo un complejo. Yo voy a enfatizar más las condiciones del país a lo interno y cómo, como bien decía el juez Galvez, justamente durante este año la población estuvo como muy expectante. Realmente el año previo, el 2024-23, fue realmente un año muy complejo. Creo que todo el mundo lo sabemos, las dificultades para acceder realmente al presidente y tomar posesión fueron muy complejas. finalmente tomó posesión el 14 de enero del 2024, ya tenemos un año del gobierno del presidente Arevalo. Sin embargo, durante este año han habido muy pocos cambios y eso le ha llevado realmente a perder apoyo al presidente Arevalo durante todo este año. Realmente creo que la mayor parte de ciudadanos guatemaltecos hubieran esperado un cambio mucho más dramático, porque las estructuras que en alguna medida se opusieron, que en alguna medida tienen la culpa de que el juez Gálvez esté exiliado, por ejemplo, y una serie de personas estén exiliadas, pues siguen en sus puestos, siguen trabajando, siguen en alguna medida haciendo complot cotidianamente para desbancar al gobierno, para limitar su capacidad de acción, para perseguir a los opositores. Entonces, en ese sentido, lamentablemente, hemos tenido un año de expectativas, de luchas, un año en el que el presidente Arevalo está tratando probablemente de hacer muchas cosas, pero tiene un cerco político institucional muy fuerte. En primer lugar, las Cortes. Bueno, en primer lugar, el ente investigador, el Ministerio Público, que obviamente se ha dedicado en toda la medida realmente a obstaculizar todo lo que puede, ya incluso a encarcelar en alguna medida personas cercanas al gobierno. En otro punto, realmente tenemos toda una serie de jueces y magistrados, las principales cortes del país, la Corte Suprema de Justicia, la Corte de Constitucionalidad y una serie de jueces emblemáticos como el juez Freddy Orellana y otros más, están liderando toda una persecución penal que en alguna medida, en inglés se utiliza un término que se llama, digamos, ahí no me acuerdo cómo se llama, pero es la guerra jurídica, realmente es una guerra que se utiliza desde la perspectiva legal. Entonces la ley se utiliza como un mecanismo de persecución política, y este es un elemento realmente que pues, se ha visto durante todo el año 2024. Tenemos obviamente ese como un peligro. Estamos ya en proceso, probablemente en unos meses va a empezar ya el proceso de elección de la fiscal, pero las piezas ya se están moviendo de la nueva fiscal o nuevo fiscal, ya se están moviendo para reelegir a Consuelo Porras. Entonces, la oposición en Guatemala sigue fortaleciéndose. Hay que decir también que el sistema de partidos políticos dominantes en Guatemala es contrario a las opciones del presidente Arevalo. Y entonces tenemos todo un cerco político, institucional, legal, que en alguna medida se opone de manera sistemática al presidente Arevalo. Esa sería como la parte negativa. Yo siempre lo digo, realmente es una permanente amenaza que en algún momento también amenaza, valga la redundancia, con destituir al mismo presidente. Quizás una de las cosas que uno como analista en alguna medida tiene que anticipar es si realmente el presidente Arevalo va a terminar su presidencia o si en alguna medida este cerco político institucional va a determinar que él mismo termine en la cárcel. Esperemos que eso no ocurra, pero mientras las fuerzas políticas e institucionales se mantengan en sus puestos, como actualmente ocurre, la posibilidad de que el mismo presidente Arevalo termine en la cárcel es una posibilidad. Ahorita todavía no sensible, pero puede ser en el mediano o largo plazo una posibilidad dolorosa. ¿Cuál es, digamos, la esperanza? Porque el título de este webinar es La esperanza para Guatemala. Yo creo que la sociedad guatemalteca demostró que cuando se une, cuando trabaja conjuntamente, cuando, digamos, persigue un sueño, como en este caso persiguió el sueño de Arevalo, hay posibilidad de transformación. Y esta todavía, digamos, es algo que no se ha terminado de materializar. La sociedad guatemalteca es muy vibrante, muy capaz. El mismo juez Gálvez lo mencionó, los 105 días de manifestaciones de la población indígena que frente al Ministerio Público defendieron la democracia. Eso es un hito histórico en Guatemala. Realmente nunca había ocurrido algo similar. Y eso es un elemento que hay que enfatizar. Realmente creo que en Guatemala están ocurriendo cosas muy malas, pero también cosas muy buenas. Hay una sociedad civil que realmente quiere un cambio, que no ha logrado encontrar un canal institucional para hacerse, digamos, expresar. Quizás la gran debilidad de Guatemala es que la sociedad civil todavía no tiene canales políticos para influir en el ámbito del sistema político. Esa es una tarea pendiente, entonces hay que fortalecer los partidos políticos que lleven a las opciones como Bernardo Arevalo y otras más, que empiecen la transformación. Es un camino bastante largo y bastante complejo, pero ese es un camino que hay que enfatizar. De lo contrario, digamos que el presidente Arevalo termina su presidencia, pero ¿qué va a ocurrir en el 2027? Si no tenemos un candidato que pudiera continuar con las cosas positivas que hubiera podido haber hecho el presidente Arevalo. Esa es una amenaza muy sentida y muy fuerte que yo siempre lo señalo, porque la derecha, digamos, los actores políticos que en alguna medida son contrarios a Arevalo, siguen fortaleciendo, siguen trabajando en la sombra y están preparando el escenario para que en el 2027 volvamos a un retroceso autoritario y obviamente a un reencauce de las cosas como tradicionalmente han ocurrido en Guatemala. Entonces, el panorama es muy complejo, el panorama es muy difícil, pero la esperanza es que el pueblo de Guatemala haya aprendido en alguna medida de las cosas que han ocurrido en este año y en los años anteriores, de manera que empiece a preparar todo su arsenal, toda su capacidad, toda su unidad realmente para enfrentarnos a los desafíos del futuro, que es desmantelar el Estado corrupto, el Estado persecutor, el Estado, digamos, autoritario, que es el que está actualmente vigente. Esa sería un poco mi intervención. Creo que pues ese es más o menos el panorama para Guatemala en estos momentos.
Thank you, Luis, for giving us insight into the context and also lifting up the positive actions that have been taken by the indigenous population and others. It's good to see those movements for hope and change. And now we turn to Pat Davis.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you for that analysis on Guatemala given by Judge Galvez and Luis Mack. That was really complete. I just want to add a few things. One thing that I think is important is to keep the most vulnerable people of Guatemala in the forefront. And those are the environmental defenders, the indigenous leaders. According to UDEFUEGUA, which is a human rights monitoring and documentation organization in Guatemala, 22 human rights defenders were killed between January 2024 and the end of October. And that is almost a 500% increase over the prior year. And so while Arevalo is attempting to push forward a more progressive agenda, there's a backlash. And the people who are most affected by that backlash are not often the ones in the news media, but there is a systematic attack on indigenous defenders, and land defenders, and environmental defenders, as the economic that is so used to having impunity and being able to exploit indigenous land and resources without any kind of restraint are pushing back. And what they're pushing back against, it's important to mention too, Arevalo hasn't been successful in what he set out to do in all areas, but he has made some inroads. And one of the things he did last February was meet with 4 major indigenous groups or cooperatives in the country and establish a working plan, a roadmap for bringing for finally addressing the needs of the indigenous and especially needs of land. Land is a huge issue in Guatemala. It's the lack of land and the lack of fertile farmable land is one of the major, if not the major driver of migration from Guatemala. So in Guatemala, for example, 92% of small producers occupy 22% of the land, which leaves very little for each person farm, while 57% of the land is farmed by large conglomerations of agro-industry. So there's a real land crisis in Guatemala, and it doesn't get talked about. It really wasn't part of the Roots Causes initiative that the Biden administration undertook. They were more focused on investment, development of clean energy, and these kind of large-scale development projects actually are driving people off the land. And so it's really a mixed bag when people see the solution to the lack of jobs in Guatemala as hydroelectric plants, solar plants, mines. All of those things don't create very many jobs, but they do drive the indigenous off their land and make the resources such as water and land and other things they need to live unavailable. and polluted. And one thing that's important to note is in many of these cases, Indigenous have relationships with their land and with their rivers that are religious. They consider these sacred. And so when they're evicted from their land because of land conflicts that have endured for years, or because a mining company is coming in without consultation, is driving them off the land, they're also losing part of what should be their right to worship. And so another thing besides the assassinations that have increased are the evictions, the violent and often warrantless evictions carried out by private actors, but sometimes carried out by police with a judicial order from land. In all of Yamate, the previous president's administration, there were 17 evictions from land. And in only the first 6 months of this year, there were 15. And so there's a backlash on that level too. Because Arevalo is meeting monthly with Indigenous leaders throughout the country, Arevalo or his administration, and because he has made a commitment to addressing the needs of the Indigenous, and because of this initial roadmap that was developed, those who stand to lose, those who advocate for the status quo, the economic elite, are lashing out also with evictions. And so I think one of the most important things we can do is keep this issue, the land issue, the need to give the Indigenous people of Guatemala, who are the majority, an attempt to stay in Guatemala, some actual ability to live there. And I think Arevalo is trying to do that. He's trying to address these longstanding land conflicts that have been ignored. The right to ancestral ownership of land is not recognized in Guatemala, and there's no legal certainties. A lot of cases where people are evicted, there's no effort made prior to their eviction to determine who actually owns the land. If they're on land and they can't produce a land title, they can be evicted, and they're accused of aggravated trespassing. And while there weren't so many evictions under the Yamate administration compared to this current administration, there were a number of things the Yamate administration did that made the situation as bad as it is now. And one of the things they did was in 2020, they closed the Secretariat of Agrarian Affairs, which was a negotiating, kind of a permanent negotiating table that had been set up to resolve land conflicts. They also closed the Secretariat of Peace, which through the National Reparations Program provided financial reparations and restoration of individuals who had suffered losses during the internal armed conflict. And then there were other institutions that were created under Yamate. In 2023, the Public Ministry inaugurated the Special Prosecutor's Office on the Crime of Usurpation. And usurpation is basically trespassing. And so this office prosecutes Indigenous and Campesino communities for trespassing if they can't produce land they're living on. As more than 1,500 people in the departments of Alta and Baja Veracruz alone have arrest warrants pending on this charge. So there's been a real campaign to get Indigenous people off their land so that it can be opened up to monoculture, large fincas, usually banana fincas, palm oil plantations, as well as mines. And Arevalo is attempting, or has made efforts in this direction to attempt to address the land crisis, but then he comes right up against the economic elite who are trying to drive him out of office. So it's not a thing that he can undertake easily, and he needs international support if he's going to be able to address it at all. And migration will continue as long as the ancestral rights of the Indigenous to land are not recognized. They're farmers, and their connection to the land is sacred. And of course, one of the biggest groups coming across the U.S. border attempting to are Guatemalans, and most of those who try to come to the U.S. are Indigenous, and most of them are from the western region of Guatemala, Huehuetenango, San Marcos, and Alta Verapaz. And as development projects have have increased in Alto Verapaz, migration has increased. So between 2020 and 2022, migration from Alto Verapaz increased by 330%, faster than anywhere else in the country, and more than 3 times the national rate. And that's the area where there are a lot of resources. They're putting in many, many hydroelectric dams, mines, sugarcane, bananas, African palms. And so this is something to keep in these palm oil plantation supply giants like Cargill and Nestle with palm oil. And so the Biden administration's efforts to create investment included companies like Nestle and Cargill. And so, really, I don't think that that was the most effective way to try to keep people in Guatemala. I think the most effective way is to support President Arevalo as he attempts to dialogue with Indigenous leaders and make inroads with the land shortage and the land conflicts that have plagued Guatemala for centuries and are driving people off their land. One of the things I did want to bring up is one of the things that Arevalo has committed to is trying to create a public policy to protect human rights defenders and journalists. And this policy was mandated by the Inter-American Court in 2014. And it was done by civil society. They came up with a whole series of protocols as part of this human rights defender protection policy. But it was dropped in 2020, again under Yamate. So Arevalo's administration has been actively carrying out work on this protocol and has also revived the instance for the analysis of patterns of attacks on the human rights defenders, which is located in the Ministry of the Interior. That is something that had been in operation that was also dropped under President Yamate. And Arevalo has made other efforts. He's increased minimum wage by 10% for agricultural and non-agricultural activities, and by 6% for expert and maquila sectors. And he renovated, according to his speech on his 100-day, on his year in office mark, he renovated 11,000 schools, doubled the budget for school materials, reached a 92% supply rate for Guatemala's 48 hospital centers, which is historic, created 14 new health centers, renovated about half of the existing ones. He does have things that he has undertaken that he's trying to do. But until he addresses land issues, migration is going to continue. And I do have more that I could say about migration and about the relationship with the Trump administration, but I think one of the things that's important is our narrative. I think the important things that we can do are witness, which I know the Presbyterian Church is doing in Guatemala, document as possible abuses and the conditions on the ground. And then really important is speaking out, and speaking out with the narrative that basically there are several talking points, and this can be used in whatever situation where you may have a voice. And the talking points are the ones that I just mentioned. That Guatemala is one of the world's poorest countries with a poverty rate of 77%, an extreme shortage of land, and soaring rates of malnutrition. And this is leading to migration, and Arevalo is trying to make change. And I think whether he's able to or not is going to depend a lot on what happens with the Trump administration in relation to Guatemala. Marco Rubio is going to Guatemala next Monday, and he has had long relations with the business sector in Guatemala. He was one of the main forces in driving out CICIG because he cut U.S. funding to CICIG. CICIG was the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which was actually making a lot of progress on investigating corruption cases and high-level corruption cases, and putting people in jail, like President Otto Perez Molina. They were making huge strides, and Marco Rubio was being heavily lobbied by the economic and by the Guatemala right wing, and he ended up withdrawing support from CICIG, cutting U.S. funding to CICIG, and CICIG was driven out of the country. And so he has those long-time relations with the right in Guatemala, but not all hope is lost, because when Arevalo was attempting to take his position as president, and there was an effort to prevent him from doing that, Arevalo, Rubio was one of the co-signers and one of the co-sponsors of a letter to demand that he be allowed to take his seat. And Rubio also wrote a letter last February congratulating Arevalo on continuing to recognize Taiwan, instead of China, as other countries in the region were switching their allegiance. And Arevalo has also taken in Venezuelan refugees who had been political prisoners. And so Arevalo can be a real ally for the Trump administration. What Arevalo is up against, and what we're up against as people who advocate for human rights in Guatemala, is this powerful right-wing lobby. This right-wing lobby, for example, is pretty has pretty far-reaching tentacles. There, you may not know it, but Rudy Giuliani has a podcast, and recently had a person who is an American but has done a lot of water carrying for the Guatemalan elite and the Guatemala military officers, who was on his podcast and called for the prosecution, or the investigation and prosecution by the Justice Department of State Department leaders who were influential in ensuring that Arevalo was seated. So let me just find, and I can read to you what he said. Yeah, his name is Steve Hecht, I believe. And they were asking, and the Liga Pro Patria has also put out a statement, which is a group of former military and military allied people. They put out a statement yesterday saying, we want to urge Rubio to support the proper application of the law, and basically implying that that means removing him from office. And yeah, Steve Hecht was interviewed by Giuliani and said, it's important to have this this investigation of the State Department's role in the 2023 elections, and take corrective measures and allow the US people to know what happened in the elections. They're still arguing that they were fraudulent. And so against that voice, we need to be a voice. And we need to be a voice speaking out for the Indigenous, for the efforts Arevalo is making, and for democracy. So we have our work cut out for us. And the Guatemala Human Rights Commission has developed some talking points for letters to the editor of local newspapers that you may be able to write to, for pieces that you might write, but along those lines of support for democracy, especially from the international community, is really important in this moment. And I think we have to be part of the hope. All of us who are standing up and standing alongside the Guatemalan people need to be part of that hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for making the connection between land and migration, and also showing how the corrupt elite are operating both in our country and Guatemala, and the need for us to speak out in whatever context we are. So I'm going to turn this over to Veronica who's going to moderate the question and answers. Veronica.
Well, thank you, Catherine. So I will be asking the questions in Spanish because I think most of the panelists speak Spanish, and we received over 60 questions, so that's why we are unable to ask all of them, but I try to divide them by group and put some together in order that we cover most of the topics that were asked. So, juez, voy a empezar con una pregunta con usted. Con el contexto que se ha analizado el día de hoy en este panel, digámoslo así, ¿qué tan probable ve usted o es posible que el presidente Arevalo pueda completar su mandato? Si es que nos podría dar su perspectiva al respecto. Ah,
Muy bien, Verónica. Fíjese que sí, con relación a este tema, ya había hecho referencia en la ponencia que se hizo. Fíjese que la preocupación que siempre ha existido es, primero, que el partido Semilla no tomara posesión, o sea, no se juramentara a Bernardo Arevalo. Ahora que se juramentó, la preocupación es que sigue la criminalización en el tema Semilla. Últimamente llama la atención que fue capturado el abogado Eduardo Gabriel Masaya Juárez, que la característica fundamental, indistintamente que uno no puede prejuzgar más allá del proceso porque no lo conoce, pero llama la atención que era de una planilla 10, de una planilla 10 que desde mi punto de vista es una planilla de las más transparentes. Y este abogado, Eduardo Gabriel Masaya Juárez, fue detenido precisamente cuando formaba parte de la planilla. El día de ayer se le dictó se le dictó el auto de procesamiento y prisión preventiva. Entonces, pero esto es complemento a lo que usted me pregunta, ¿qué opino con relación a si Bernardo Arevalo va a completar su mandato? Uno de los problemas mayores que hemos analizado es las contiendas que quedan, son muy fuertes. El tema de la Corte de Constitucionalidad y la elección de fiscal general como que genera más sensibilidad en el tema en Guatemala y por eso es precisamente el temor ante la cantidad de antejuicios que tiene Bernardo Arevalo, que no lo dejen llegar a esa elección, especialmente la de fiscal general. El problema es que el fiscal general o la fiscal general, desde mi punto de vista, es una pieza fundamental para consolidar la democracia en Guatemala. Y ahí es donde se pueden iniciar una cantidad de procesos en contra de funcionarios públicos que han sido señalados específicamente en el tema de corrupción y que el Ministerio Público sea objetivo en sus investigaciones y no se dedique solo a perseguir a personas relacionadas con derechos humanos, operadores de justicia, defensores de la tierra. Entonces, en conclusión, la pregunta para mí es un poco difícil tomando en consideración el contexto que tenemos, que no quieren que Bernardo Arevalo elija fiscal general. Ese es uno de los problemas. Gracias, Verónica.
Gracias, juez. La siguiente pregunta es para Luis. Luis, ¿sí está aquí?
Aquí estoy.
Ok, ya, solo porque no veía la cámara, no estaba segura, sí. Ok, por favor, ¿podrías compartir pensamientos sobre la relación entre los movimientos sociales guatemaltecos, por ejemplo, campesino, indígena, feminista y otros, y la administración del presidente Arevalo?
Ya, pues obviamente el presidente Arevalo tiene en estos momentos solamente una conexión bastante buena con la mayoría de movimientos sociales. Sin embargo, hay un problema, digamos, un obstáculo bastante grande entre el presidente y los movimientos que lo apoyan. En primer lugar, porque prometió, digamos, algunas cosas, algunos cambios que no ha logrado. El mismo presidente, por ejemplo, con respecto a los pueblos indígenas, a pesar de que fue ampliamente apoyado por los pueblos indígenas, el presidente nombró muy pocas personas dentro de su gabinete que, digamos, que tengan conexión con el movimiento indígena. Ha tenido muy poca, digamos, respuesta a las demandas de los grupos organizados. Y además, el ente persecutorio, el Ministerio Público y los juzgados siguen persiguiendo defensores de derechos humanos, siguen obstaculizando realmente y generando una serie de zozobra en las comunidades, las invasiones, digamos, el desalojo a las comunidades y toda una serie de amenazas se siguen dando. Y por lo tanto, pues obviamente porque el presidente Arevalo no puede incidir en esa parte legal e institucional, pues obviamente ese contexto adverso se le sigue reclamando al presidente, porque a pesar de que él tiene una conexión y digamos, una mayor apertura a los movimientos sociales, no ha tenido las condiciones para cumplir, para fortalecerse, digamos, en las acciones que necesita hacer y obviamente contrarrestar las acciones de los entes legales que pues siguen haciendo averías y problemas en el caso de Guatemala. Así que es una relación buena pero tensa. Y el apoyo obviamente que tiene el presidente Arevalo se va erosionando conforme pasa el tiempo, por supuesto, porque la población, la ciudadanía, los movimientos sociales no ven lamentablemente una respuesta ni una actitud contundente del presidente que enfrente a estas mafias legales y políticas. O sea, en Guatemala, digamos, existe la idea de que el presidente Arevalo es demasiado democrático, demasiado legalista, y en un país con estas mafias, eso paradójicamente se ve como un defecto. Así que, pues sí, tiene buena relación, pero lamentablemente ese apoyo lo va perdiendo conforme pasa el tiempo y se van erosionando las condiciones institucionales del gobierno de Guatemala.
Gracias, Luis. The next question is for Pat. So what can we do to support efforts for peace, justice, and democracy in Guatemala? They are looking for ways to advocate for Guatemala.
I think this speaking out that I mentioned is so important. Writing letters to the editor of your local paper after Rubio's visit, for example, because there will be something in the paper about what he said, what he discussed with Arevalo. That's an opportunity to write your letter to the editor, say the story, and this kind of relationship is very important, and these are the things that we're concerned about. These are things that need to be addressed. So we will have talking points on that after Arevalo's visit, and after Rubio's visit, and we have also talking points now for a pre-visit sort of letter, if you were interested in beginning some of those letters to the editor or letters in your local church newspapers, letters, whatever forum you have for speaking out is important. Also, communicating with your members of Congress, especially if they happen to be on the Foreign Affairs Committee or the Foreign Relations Committee, raising awareness about the importance of supporting democracy in Guatemala and how that aligns with the current administration's wish to stem migration. And then there are individual things on a more person-to-person level that we can do to support people in Guatemala. There are campaigns that have been undertaken in the past that we participated in and that we may be leading again, where you can raise awareness about a particular case. So, for example, in the case of Estrada Campo, who has been in pretrial detention for more than a year without ever even being able to give his testimony because his hearing keeps being suspended. A campaign where people are filmed or photographed holding signs saying we support Estrada Campo, he's being detained, that kind of thing can have an effect. So those kind of real individual actions on individual cases that raise awareness and also offer support to the people who are undergoing this kind of repression can be really important. One of the things to keep in mind is that the killings, the evictions, and these kinds of criminalizations and arrest have an effect of sowing despair. They may be intended to sow despair. And part of what we need to do is show our solidarity. And so, stay tuned to what you can do to help. You can sign up for our email list, which Veronica put in the chat, and we send out urgent actions when we need someone, when someone is arrested or attacked, and we need to raise awareness about it. And those can involve calling the embassy, writing your senators or Congress or a member of the House. There are a lot of ways. And so I would just say, if you could sign up for our email list, that would give you the opportunity to take action and to know what kind of campaigns we're developing. I think both types are important, both the big picture of what the State Department should be doing and raising awareness about that and getting that into the public, the US public, especially to counter the narrative that the intransigent sectors in Guatemala want to put out into the US public, which is that the State Department was corrupt under Biden and the election of Arevalo was fraudulent and he must be removed and this must be corrected. We have to counter that narrative. But I think also these individual actions of support by individuals, person to person, are very important too.
Thank you, Pat. So I will go back to George Galvez. Pues la siguiente pregunta es, ¿cuáles son las implicaciones de las tendencias autoritarias en la región para los esfuerzos anticorrupción y pro democracia del gobierno Semilla en Guatemala?
Fíjese que el tema es bastante complicado. Lamentablemente los países de la región, lo que es América del Sur y lo que es Centroamérica, lamentablemente reciben mucho apoyo de la comunidad internacional, pero especialmente de Estados Unidos. Programas de USAID, programas de AID en Guatemala, lamentablemente están suspendidos. Entonces, eso en determinado momento genera una descomposición mayor porque se permiten, en este caso, especialmente el tema de drogas, el tema de corrupción y el tema actual del Ministerio Público, considero que agudiza más la situación de Guatemala. Lamentablemente, los esfuerzos anticorrupción y los esfuerzos por la democracia en el tema de Guatemala considero que está frustrada, ya que desde mi punto de vista, la fiscal general, o sea, el Ministerio Público, se ha dedicado a estar criminalizando un montón de defensores de derechos humanos, pero no se ha concentrado específicamente en los temas de corrupción, en los temas de narcotráfico. Y ahora, con la disminución de las ayudas de los programas de Estados Unidos, considero que va a agudizar más el tema de Guatemala. Pat hace referencia específicamente a uno de los problemas de los pueblos originales, hace referencia a las tierras, hace referencia a las extracciones minerales y hace referencia específicamente que todo ese problema que se da, el efecto que tiene es que la mayoría de gente tiende a salir de las comunidades y por eso es que se da la migración hacia otros países. Entonces, ese es el problema que yo puedo analizar con el tema de los esfuerzos específicamente con los temas anticorrupción. Y eso genera una descomposición mayor porque en determinado momento no hay apoyo. Se está disminuyendo el apoyo para consolidar las democracias en Guatemala. Gracias.
Gracias, juez. Muchísimas gracias por su respuesta. Bueno, relacionado justamente a este tema, la siguiente pregunta es para Luis y es, ¿cuál ha sido el impacto de la presidencia de Arevalo en la protección de los derechos humanos y de los defensores de derechos humanos?
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Bueno, como decía yo en la respuesta anterior, el hecho de que el presidente tenga uno de los poderes del Estado, que es el Ejecutivo, pues determina que el trato hacia, digamos, defensores humanos, el acompañamiento de las fuerzas de seguridad y todo lo demás, pues sea cualitativamente mejor al que había en otros años. en donde las fuerzas de seguridad se prestaban, obviamente, para colaborar con la intimidación, la persecución, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, el hecho de que el presidente Arevalo esté en la presidencia, pues significa que al menos no existe realmente un interés del Ejecutivo por estar persiguiendo ni por estar intimidando o, digamos, vigilando a los defensores de derechos humanos. Eso, en ese contexto de Guatemala, ya es mucho. Ahora, sin embargo, la Policía Nacional Civil sigue acompañando, por ejemplo, los desarrollos, etcétera, etcétera, porque, por supuesto, la Policía Nacional Civil no está desvinculada de las órdenes de captura y de las, digamos, directrices que le dan los jueces, los magistrados, el Ministerio Público, y esa parte sigue controlada por los mismos de siempre. Entonces es como una suerte de gallo gallina, diríamos en Guatemala. Hay una parte positiva, pero hay una parte negativa que persiste y que lamentablemente el gobierno de Arevalo no puede hacer nada. En algún momento el presidente Arevalo salió en conferencia de prensa diciendo yo no voy a acatar órdenes del Ministerio Público, y obviamente hubo ahí una amenaza de, digamos, de desarrollarle o, digamos, de plantearle medidas legales, e inmediatamente el presidente tuvo que dar marcha atrás, porque obviamente por el marco legal e institucional de Guatemala él no puede hacer mayor cosa. Entonces, sí es un avance, pero lamentablemente se mantiene la amenaza y la persecución penal en contra de defensores de derechos humanos.
Gracias, Luis. Am, ok, la siguiente pregunta es para Pat y creo que luego voy a cubrir un poco las preguntas que están aquí en el chat, simplemente para dar la oportunidad a los que quizás no vieron la opción de preguntar. So this question is for Pat. What's the reason for the Guatemalan government's silence regarding the deportation of migrants from the United States?
Okay. I think the Guatemalan government is trying to be very careful to keep the support of the U.S. And the government has made statements about the importance of migrants' rights being respected after the planes arrived on Monday. And so I don't think it's been total silence. But I do think the Guatemalan government has to be careful because they're trying to keep the favor of the United States government, which is so essential to Arevalo being able to stay in office. And so I noticed that there have been other questions about migration, including whether Guatemala is receiving currently citizens from other countries. And the president said that he was open to discussing that. And so I think that will probably be one of the things that he does in order to curry favor with the U.S. He also says that he thinks that they can take in 2,500 citizens a week. The Guatemalan officials have announced that they can accommodate that many that are being deported. That's about 9 times the number that arrived on Monday in 3 separate flights. 2 were military and 1 was commercial airliner. That would be a little more than twice the number of migrants that Guatemala received last year. And so Arevalo has said in interviews that he is strengthening the consulates in the U.S. He's strengthening the legal advisors in the consulates. He's set up an app so that migrants in the U.S. can have direct contact with the consulates. And he said that he may be constructing shelters and that they have a reintegration program that will train migrants who are coming back from Guatemala and help them reintegrate into life in Guatemala. And he's also said that he will, that all of this is part of an effort to allow them to live with dignity in their homeland, with jobs and with a means of feeding their families. And so, for example, in one interview that I saw with him, he talked about how some people coming back have learned English, they've worked in the hospitality industry, they have skills. And I think part of what Arevalo is going to be doing is looking for ways to, of course, deal with what could potentially be a huge influx, but also ways to integrate into Guatemalan society in a way that's not disruptive. If Trump invokes the Alien Enemies Act, and if he decides that because Guatemalans are from a region that where a security threat has been identified, because in El Salvador, he named MS-13, the gang, as a security risk or a national security threat, deeming them a terrorist organization. If he decides that Guatemala is of a country that should be considered, or that Central America in general is part of a region or an area that could be considered as part of an invasion, then there could be massive deportation, even of people with legal status. And we won't know until, I think, February 3rd is one of the next deadlines, and then March 20th is another deadline, and I believe it's March 20th is the deadline for him to declare what countries, if he invokes the Alien Enemies Act, are subject to that. We have this, GHRC will have this up on their website, what these different executive orders are and the dates. And I think it's unlikely that Guatemala would be considered, under that category. But just keeping in mind that Arevalo is currently saying he can take almost double the number that were received last year, and is willing to look at taking others from other countries. I think it's going to be a huge strain on the economy. And if there is a massive deportation, it's going to be an even greater strain because of the cutoff of remittances, which comprise about 20% of the GDP. It's going to be pretty destabilizing.
Thank you so much, Pat, for your insights. Pues ahora le voy a hacer una pregunta que fue puesta aquí en el chat y dice, ¿qué sugiere para hacerle frente a la divulgación de noticias falsas, es decir, postverdad? Esa pregunta fue hecha por Luis Argueta.
Fíjese que esa es una de las 3P que estaba haciendo referencia a la famosa teoría de la posverdad. Y el problema es que esto no es un tema que se puede analizar en este momento. En Alemania ya se utilizó este aspecto, y por eso es que un asesor del primer ministro le hace referencia a que hay que decir una mentira 1000 veces y la 1001 ya va a ser verdad. O sea, el problema es que este tema es, y esto lo ha tratado mucho un alemán, Gobel, que son las 18 teorías del poder. Entonces, pero bueno, el problema de esto es que nosotros tenemos que tratar de estar bien informados. Ahorita, por ejemplo, se dan el lujo de criticar a una persona y vienen las mismas personas que os contratan, le dan retweet y se va extendiendo y se va haciendo una bola. Entonces tenemos que tener cuidado para establecer el tema de la posverdad, porque entiendo que la posverdad es distorsionar deliberada de una verdad que manipula las creencias y emociones con el fin de influir en la opinión pública y en las actitudes sociales. Yo considero que uno de los aspectos fundamentales es tratar de mantenernos informados, tratar de generar al máximo redes, como lo decía Pat, redes de comunicación con otras agrupaciones, para que en determinado momento como que se pueda contrarrestar toda esta situación. Y específicamente este tipo de eventos que se están organizados, considero que son importantes para que las personas vayan sensibilizándose un poco más en estos temas, pero especialmente puedan profundizar con relación a estos términos que se están volviendo muy usuales. Uno de los libros, con esto concluyo, uno de los libros que para mí ha sido muy interesante es Cómo mueren las democracias, que son dos escritores de la Universidad de Harvard, que es muy importante. Y otro libro que también me ha permitido conocer un poco más, extenderme en los temas actuales, es La revancha de los poderosos, de Moisés Naim, que para mí son buenos y valdría la pena si en determinado momento se pudieran consultar. Muchas gracias, Verónica.
Gracias, Wes. Thank you. Also, I think maybe I will leave it here because to stick to the schedule that we planned for this webinar. And I would just like to say on behalf of the Guatemala Human Rights Commission, thank you for being here and joining us in the struggle for a better Guatemala. And your support is really important. So please follow our social media platforms or to stay up of what's happening or will happen in Guatemala. And I will give the floor to Catherine.
Thanks to all of you for joining us, and we'll be sure to send out all of the resources that were mentioned to those who registered. And it's so important right now to be in solidarity with each other. And I always find it, even though these issues are so awful right now, being in solidarity with each other and other people in other countries who are facing similar things is so very important. So thank you for attending.
Thank you so much for organizing and for all your work.